This is Mr. E, also known as the Bearded Music Teacher, and this is the first episode of the beginning of rock. To give you a little bit of background, this podcast channel is devoted to supplying my students with a concise or condensed version of my lectures that I usually give at the middle school level that kind of just gives you the nuts and bolts of everything without diving into the listening activities that I do in class and the discussions that we have. So this is kind of like a brief overview, if you will. So I am simultaneously doing a video with this as well as the audio. Feel free to find me on Twitter, which is Mr. So MR underscore E underscore the word music and then FCS. So that's a great way to find me on Twitter. And I'll be posting things throughout there. That's my professional account. All right, so let's take a look at Unit 1, the beginning. And we're really talking about the radio of this time. And we have to realize that radio was the dominant form of information, the information highway, if you will. Nowadays, we have things like the internet, TV, streaming. We can even stream, even if we don't have cable TV or an antenna, we can stream through our devices, any device. Live news, live TV, things like that. You can even stream your local news channel on your mobile device. So radio back then started in 1920, but just to kind of set the scene on where we're going, we're actually going to lead up in this unit all the way up to where we have Elvis on the Milton Berle show. And he got the nickname Elvis the Pelvis. And that's what caused the Ed Sullivan Show to, when it was on a TV show, to shoot him or picture him on TV from the waist up. And we'll get into details of all that. But radio was at first regional broadcasting. So what does that mean? Well, that means that your local region, so I'm located in the United States. If you're listening internationally, that's awesome. We're going to use big cities for this. So let's say I was in Jacksonville, Florida in the 1920s. I would get radio from the southeastern part of the United States. Maybe not as high as northern Alabama. It wouldn't be that far. It'd be very, very localized. And this really develops the flavors and the genres that make up and kind of tie in rock music. And we'll get to all that as well. So music developed and broadcast regional styles as musical acts. And the sheet music was the currency for this. The sheet music was the trading card, if you will, of everything. And what you would do typically as a person, you would actually go in the 1920s, go to the local like Woolworth's 5 and Dime store or anything that would be local there. And they would have usually a dedicated piano player or a couple piano players that would be able to play all the music for the store. And so what you would do is you pull off a piece of music. Maybe you were like, oh, well, I want to hear how this sounds. Give it to the piano player. They would play it for you. That's how you got your music. And a lot of times people learned how to play piano to some degree in order to stay current with music, or they went to shows. So the 1930s and 40s brought the golden age of motion pictures. But in 1920, we started with KDKA. And this is how we kind of got to this. So I'm kind of foreshadowing and jumping back and forth. So let's jump to the present here. In the 1920s, KDKA out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and WWJ out of Michigan, with a blend of news, local information, and live music, broadcast the first time to regional listeners. Now, what does that mean? Well, KDKA and WWJ broadcast at the same time simultaneously, so that way their regional listeners could hear music that was not available to them at the time. So what does that start to do? Well, what we start to do is we start to see the radio stations start to, I guess, talk to each other. Is what would be a good idea to talk about this that way. And by 1928, the NBC, or National Broadcast Company, they decide that they're going to make a national audience. Now, well, you have to realize that all these radio stations are really concentrated in the Northeast and upper Midwest of the United States, around like the Great Lakes regions of Lake Ontario, Huron, Ontario, Michigan, and Erie. So they're all in that. I think I named them twice, but that's okay. So what we have is we have these radio stations that were able to, with NBC, connect through the phone line. And NBC linked Philadelphia, Buffalo, Detroit, and LA. And that started to develop the national audience. Why was that important? Well, let's talk about that for a second. And that is this. At first, in the 1920s, with KDKA and WWJ, there were regional audiences. Meaning, again, if I were living in Jacksonville, Florida, I would hear music that was unique to that region, while somebody in Cleveland or Chicago may hear something completely different and grow up with a regional flavor or taste for music that was completely different from mine. For example, up in the north in Chicago, the Delta blues and electric blues was constantly seen down the Mississippi River. And later on, the electric blues was in Chicago and things like that. And so I would, if I was living in Chicago, I would hear those types of bands, big bands, jazz, blues, things like that. But if I were to go over to like Alabama and Florida, I would hear a lot of what was commonly referred to as bluegrass or hillbilly music or country music. Those are two different. Those are contrasting styles. And so when NBC linked Philadelphia, Buffalo, Detroit, and LA by phone line, we started to break down those barriers of certain regions having certain, I guess you could say, bosses of music, where you have these big local heroes. Now we have a whole new audience where people in the north are listening to music from the south, and south is listening to music from the north, east and west combined. It starts to break down all these barriers. And it opens up the information to where we can get to know what's going on in the news in big cities in the Northeast if we're living on the West Coast. At the exact same time, the information has sped up drastically in 1928 when NBC goes coast to coast. So the culture, instead of having individual regional identities, now we're starting to grow a huge culture, which, by the way, is like what we have today. We have a national audience, and dare I say, international audience, where we have these pop icons that go around the world, or just, let's just say, around our nation, and they help build the culture. When I was growing up, it was Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Blink 182. All these bands and recording artists built the national audience, and teenagers became like obsessed with these. Spice Girls is another one. So, national radio. What did the national radio and shows look like at the time? Well, we would have things like the Andrews Sisters, Bing Crosby, which those two, Andrews Sisters and Bing Crosby, are actually on White Christmas, the movie. So you might want to check that out as a side little thing there. And pop music, the big band era was big, and they really started promoting that. And country and western, now those are two separate sub genres. And then rhythm and blues were actually considered low income music and not programmed or promoted on the national audience, but they still stayed locally in the local circuit. So you have to realize that that's something that is very important. That while we had the starting of radio, there was a lot of big band, classical music, what is considered pop music or popular music. So The first broadcast that we used, go back to NBC here, is using high powered transmitters and superstations was another name for them. Okay, so these high powered transmitters were used. And the federal government licensed only a few stations, not only the high powered transmitters, but the exclusive rights to the frequencies to use. So if you jump in your car or any radio, you see numbers. That's what we call the frequencies. So let's use 100.6 as an FM frequency. So we use that, and at this point, it'd be AM radio, not FM. But let's just use 100.6 because most people use FM radio now. And so once you were given the license as a radio station, you were given the frequency to use, you use a high powered transmitter, and you broadcast coast to coast, you are now known as a clear channel. Now, here's what's fun is that NBC and AT&T use the phone lines to not only hook up the ones that I listed earlier, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Detroit, and LA, but they were able to link up 69 stations. Yes, 69 stations coast to coast. How amazing is that? And some of my listeners might go, okay, yeah, whatever, 69. Well, yay. But back then, that was a huge feat. And all they did was through phone line. No Ethernet, no Wi-Fi, phone line. That's how they broadcast. And these affiliates were part of the 69 channels, or I'm sorry, 69 stations. So affiliates are the people who broadcast the whole national picture. Okay. So if you weren't a part of this clear channel, if you did not get access by the government, the federal government, to use these high powered transmitters, but you had one and you didn't have the right to a frequency, but you still wanted to broadcast. Maybe it was too much money for you, or you didn't want to comply with the federal regulations. You would jump over the US Mexico border and set up shop there. You have to realize that back then, you could clearly see a couple radio stations as you go down through the border of the southwestern United States. You would see just over the border these high-powered transmitters broadcasting. And these became known as X stations. So let's use an example. Let's go back to the KDKA. That is a call sign, KDKA. And if it was a clear channel, it would read KDKA. But let's say KDKA moved to Mexico just over the US border and they became an X station. That would be known as X KDKA. If it was an X station, the call sign started with an X. That means it was in Mexico, technically. So then in the 1940s and 30s, mid 30s to by 1940s, radio with a national audience shifts to TV. Now, some of those things are the programming in which we'll get into the next episode. But what you have to realize is that when we started shifting to television, radio had to figure out a way to adapt. And this will wrap up our podcast episode here. What you have to realize is that as we progress, and you can look at this in cases, you can even ask your parents, and I'm talking directly to my students here, you can talk to your parents and ask about, hey, what was it like in the 90s when we had used dial-up internet connection versus now with streaming everything? A lot of people had to make the transition. A lot of radio stations, when Sirius XM satellite radio came on, a lot of people jumped to satellite radio because that was the new way of getting information, a new way of radio. All right, so that's something that maybe you should ask your parents about, or if you're a listener that's not in my class, research it. Find out these different cultural trends similar to how we shift from radio to TV. We have to adapt with the new technology. and see what you can come up with. See that there's a pattern of adaptation, where we take usually a lot of stuff that we're doing well and we just bump it over to the new technology. All right, guys, that is it for this episode. We are going to start off with the idea of what radio looked like on TV and what TV looked like on radio on the next episode.